Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to explore something that a lot of you have been asking about, and that's how autism can lead to people feeling really lonely and like they just don't fit in. It's a topic that I think deserves way more attention than it gets. And we've got an awesome mix of sources to help us really dig into this. We've got personal stories from people in the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. We've got clinical insights from experts, some really fascinating research findings, and we'll even touch on some of the latest stuff happening in genetic research and brain imaging. It's going to be a wild ride. Are you ready to dive in with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to talk about these feelings of isolation because they're often hidden.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
Okay, so I want to start with this iceberg analogy that you mentioned to me earlier. You said it's a great way to explain just how complex autism really is. Can you unpack that a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. So picture an iceberg, right? You see the tip, the part that's above the water. Those are the visible behaviors. But what's really fascinating is what's going on beneath the surface. Under the waterline, there's this whole other world, this massive unseen part of the iceberg. And that's kind of like autism. What you see on the outside doesn't even begin to tell the whole story. There's this whole hidden landscape of sensory experiences and internal struggles that can make it incredibly difficult for people with autism to connect with others. And that's what we're going to try to understand today.
Yeah, I love that. It's like we're trying to explore this underwater world and
Yeah.
figure out what's going on down there and how it all ties back to those feelings of loneliness that our listeners are so curious about.
Exactly. And, the core challenges of autism, those related to social communication, restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, and sensory sensitivities, all of these things play a role in shaping those social experiences. And these experiences can be just so different from what neurotypical people go through.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. Let's start with social communication. What makes this area so tricky for people on the spectrum? And how might it be linked to feeling lonely?
Well, imagine feeling like you're constantly missing social cues, like everyone else is speaking a language you just barely understand. That's the reality for a lot of autistic people. They might have trouble starting conversations or keeping them going. They might miss subtle facial expressions or body language, or have a hard time grasping those unwritten social rules that everyone else seems to know instinctively. All of this can lead to misunderstandings, awkward interactions, and ultimately that feeling of just not belonging.
Wow. It's like being surrounded by people but still feeling completely alone.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that these difficulties aren't because people with autism aren't trying. It's not about a lack of effort. It's a fundamental difference in how their brains process social information.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the second area you mentioned, restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. I feel like there are so many misconceptions about this part of autism. Can you help clear things up for us?
Definitely. It's crucial to understand that these behaviors aren't just quirks or something to be dismissed. They often serve very important functions. They can be sources of comfort, focus, and even joy for people with autism. For example, someone might be deeply fascinated by trains. They might know everything about them, collect model trains, even plan trips around seeing different trains. This intense interest can be incredibly fulfilling for them.
So it's not just about the behavior itself, it's about understanding the reasons behind it, the motivations that drive it.
Exactly. But unfortunately, these behaviors are often misinterpreted or seen as strange by neurotypical people. And that can lead to judgment teasing or even bullying, which just adds to those feelings of isolation.
Yeah, it's like they're being punished for finding comfort and joy in something that's different from the norm. That's got to be incredibly frustrating.
It can be incredibly isolating. And this brings us to the third area we talked about, sensory sensitivities. This is a huge part of the autism experience that often gets overlooked.
I'm ready to be blown away. Tell me more about this.
Well, many autistic people experience the world in a completely different way when it comes to their senses. Things like sounds, lights, textures, smells, things that most people can just filter out can be super intense, even painful for someone on the spectrum. Imagine being in a crowded, noisy shopping mall for someone with auditory sensitivities that could be absolute torture. Or a tag on a shirt that most people wouldn't even notice that could feel like sandpaper against the skin for someone with tactile sensitivities.
Wow, I honestly never considered that everyday experiences could be so overwhelming for someone with sensory sensitivities. So how does this all tie back to those feelings of loneliness and difficulty fitting in?
It makes participating in social situations incredibly difficult. If someone is constantly bombarded by sensory overload, they're going to want to avoid those situations altogether. They might turn down invitations, stick to familiar routines, or prefer doing things alone.
So their world starts to shrink, almost like they're retreating to protect themselves from all that sensory input. And that shrinking world leads to feelings of loneliness.
Exactly. It's a complex interplay of factors, but it really shows how the core challenges of autism can contribute to that sense of social isolation. It's not just one thing, it's all these things working together.
This is fascinating. And, there's this concept of masking that's closely connected to what we're talking about. I think it'd be great to explore that next. Can you explain what masking is and how it relates to our listeners' focus on understanding those feelings of loneliness in the context of autism?
Sure, masking is basically when autistic people consciously or unconsciously change their behavior to appear more neurotypical. It's like putting on a performance to try to fit in and avoid standing out.
So they're hiding their true selves.
In a way, yes. And while it might seem like a good way to avoid those uncomfortable social situations we were just talking about, it can come at a really high cost.
What do you mean? What kind of cost?
Well, imagine having to constantly monitor and adjust every single word and action you make just to avoid being judged or misunderstood. It's exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. It can lead to anxiety, depression, and a feeling of never truly belonging, never truly being yourself.
So even if someone is really good at masking, they might still be feeling incredibly lonely because they can't be their authentic selves.
Exactly. It's like living a double life, and that can be a very isolating experience.
I'm starting to get a much clearer picture now of why our listeners are so interested in this connection between autism and feelings of loneliness. It's so much deeper than I think a lot of people realize.
And I think it's so important to acknowledge that masking is often a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
Autistic people may have been bullied, rejected, or treated badly because of their authentic selves in the past, so they learn to mask to protect themselves.
It's a way of coping with a world that doesn't always understand or accept their differences.
Yeah.
But like you said, the long-term consequences can be really harmful to their well-being.
You're exactly right. It's a difficult situation to be in.
Okay, so we've talked about the iceberg analogy, the 3 core challenges of autism, and this idea of masking. All of these seem to play a role in those feelings of loneliness that our listeners want to understand. Where do we go from here?
I think it's time to dive into the science behind autism. What are the underlying causes? How is the autistic brain different from a neurotypical brain? And most importantly, what does all this mean for understanding the social and emotional experiences of people with autism?
I'm ready to go deeper.
Yep. So we're diving into the science behind autism now, especially how it connects to those feelings of loneliness and not fitting in that we were talking about.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated to learn more about this. We've already talked about how different the autistic experience can be, but what's actually going on in the brain that causes these differences?
Well, one of the biggest things we need to clear up right away is this whole idea that bad parenting causes autism. Science has completely debunked that myth. It's just not true.
Yeah, good riddance to that outdated idea.
Ugh.
So if it's not bad parenting, what is it? What's actually causing these differences in brain wiring, so to speak?
It seems to be this really complex mix of factors with genetics playing a major role. And scientists are using these amazing tools like genome-wide association studies and next-generation sequencing to figure out the genetics of autism. It's like they're searching for clues in this massive library of our DNA.
Wow, those sound super complex. Can you explain that in a way that our listeners can understand? What are these studies actually telling us?
They're helping us pinpoint specific genes and patterns in our genes that seem to increase the chances of developing autism. It's not as easy as finding a single autism gene. It's more like a combination of genetic factors that contribute to how the autistic brain develops.
So it's not just one gene, but a whole bunch of them working together. And I imagine the environment plays a role too, right?
Absolutely. Genes lay the foundation, but things in the environment during pregnancy and early childhood can definitely affect how those genes express themselves. It's like this, genes provide the blueprint, but the environment shapes how that blueprint gets built.
That's a great way to put it. It really shows how nature and nurture work together in shaping the brain. But let's get back to the brain itself. We talked about masking earlier, how autistic people change their behavior to fit in. Is there anything in the brain that explains why this is so common?
It's really interesting. Studies using fMRI, which lets us actually see the brain in action, have shown some really interesting differences in how the autistic brain responds to social cues. For example, the area of the brain that's associated with reward, that feeling of pleasure we get from certain experiences, often lights up differently in autistic people during social interactions.
So what you're saying is that social interaction might not be as inherently rewarding for someone with autism.
That's what the research seems to suggest. And this could be a big part of why they find social situations more difficult, less enjoyable, and ultimately more isolating.
Wow, that's a huge aha moment for me. It's not that they don't want to connect, it's that their brains aren't necessarily wired to feel the same level of reward from those connections.
Exactly. And this difference in brain activity could also be a reason why masking behaviors develop. If social interactions don't naturally feel rewarding, it makes sense that someone might try to change their behavior to avoid negative experiences.
It's like their brains are trying to find a workaround,
Yeah.
a way to navigate a social world that doesn't really line up with their internal experience.
So that's a great way to put it. And this leads us to another really important part of the autistic experience, sensory sensitivities. We touched on this earlier, but fMRI research is giving us even more insights into what's happening in the brain.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these sensory differences.
So fMRI studies show that autistic people often have way more activity in the areas of the brain that process sensory information. This means that everyday things like sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures can be a lot more intense for them sometimes, even to the point of overload.
So it's like their brains are turning up the volume on all those sensory inputs.
Exactly. And this can explain why something like a fluorescent light buzzing might be a little annoying to a neurotypical person, but totally unbearable for someone with autism.
That makes so much sense. It's not about being picky or overly sensitive. It's a real difference in how their brains process sensory information. And I imagine this can have a big impact on their social experiences too, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. If you're always dealing with sensory overload, it's going to be really hard to focus on social cues, have a conversation, or even just be present in the moment. This can lead to people withdrawing from social situations, avoiding them, and ultimately feeling lonely.
It's like they're trying to listen to a symphony of sensory information while everyone else is just hearing a simple melody. No wonder social interaction can be so tiring and overwhelming.
That's a great comparison. And this brings us back to that initial question. How does autism lead to feelings of loneliness and difficulty fitting in?
Right. We've talked about the social communication challenges, the restricted interests, the sensory sensitivities. All of these things contribute to that feeling of isolation. But is there anything else we're missing?
Well, there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet, and it's something that often gets overlooked: co-occurring conditions.
Co-occurring conditions. What does that word?
It means that autistic people often have other conditions alongside autism, like anxiety, depression, ADHD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder.
So it's not just autism they're dealing with. It's a bunch of other challenges on top of that. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It can be. And these co-occurring conditions can really affect their social experiences and make those feelings of loneliness even worse.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, imagine someone with autism who also has social anxiety. They're already dealing with challenges with social communication and sensory overload. But now they also have this intense anxiety in social situations. This can lead to them avoiding social situations, having panic attacks, and being really afraid of judgment or rejection.
So those feelings of loneliness get amplified by the co-occurring condition. It's like a double whammy.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is to address these co-occurring conditions as part of a comprehensive approach to helping autistic people.
Okay, so we've talked about the genetic and neurological basis of autism, the impact of sensory sensitivities and co-occurring conditions, and why social interaction can be so challenging for autistic individuals. Where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for the future of autism understanding and treatment?
Well, that's where things get really exciting. We're seeing a ton of research focus on personalized treatment approaches, assistive technologies, and even the potential for artificial intelligence to bridge the communication gap between autistic and neurotypical people.
That sounds super promising. I can't wait to explore those ideas in the vocation.
You're listening to Echoes of Insight, where we dive deep into the topics shaping our world, from the planet and politics to health, consciousness, economy, and alternative lifestyles. If you're enjoying the journey, make sure to subscribe and share this podcast with others who love exploring new perspectives.
Part 3 of our deep dive. Join us as we look into the future of autism and discover some innovative ways that people are working to create a more inclusive world. Okay, so we've spent the last 2 parts really digging deep into how and why autism is linked to loneliness. Yeah, the challenges of the brain science. It's complicated stuff, but I think we're starting to get a better picture now.
Yeah, definitely. And the more we understand, the more possibilities open up. And that's what's so exciting about this next part of our conversation.
Right. You mentioned personalized treatment, assistive technology, and even AI.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on the cusp of some major breakthroughs. Where do we start?
Well, let's start with personalized treatment. Traditionally, autism treatment has been kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, but as we learn more about the genetics and neurology behind autism, we're realizing that every individual's experience is different.
So it's kind of like how medicine is becoming more personalized in other areas. Now we're seeing that same shift happening in autism treatment.
Exactly. Imagine a future where we can look at a person's genes, their brain activity patterns, their specific challenges, and create a treatment plan that's tailor-made for them. It would be so much more effective than a generic approach.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like getting a custom-made suit versus trying to squeeze everyone into the same off-the-rack size.
That's a perfect analogy. And this personalized approach could be used for everything from therapy and medication to education strategies and even making changes to their environment.
Speaking of environmental changes, you mentioned assistive technologies. What kinds of innovations are we seeing in that area?
There are all these new technologies being developed specifically to help people with autism manage their sensory sensitivities and navigate a world that can often feel overwhelming. Like noise-canceling headphones can filter out distracting sounds, weighted blankets can provide calming, deep pressure stimulation, and sensory-friendly clothing can minimize tactile irritation.
It's amazing how technology can create these tools that can make such a big difference in someone's life.
It really is. And it's not just about managing challenges. It's about giving autistic individuals the power to participate more fully in the world around them.
Okay, so we've talked about personalized treatment and assistive technology.
Right.
What about AI? That seems like a total game changer.
AI has incredible potential to change how we understand and support people with autism. For example, researchers are developing AI-powered communication tools that can help interpret social cues, facilitate conversations, and even translate emotions.
So AI could almost act like a bridge between the autistic and neurotypical world.
Exactly. It could help break down those communication barriers and create a deeper understanding between people who have different ways of processing social information.
That's so exciting.
Right.
But as with any powerful technology, I imagine there are ethical considerations to keep in mind.
You're absolutely right. It's really important to make sure that AI is used to empower people with autism, not to try and normalize them or erase their unique perspectives.
So involving autistic people in the development and implementation of these technologies is crucial.
Absolutely. Their voices and perspectives need to be front and center in all of this.
You're listening to Echoes of Insight, where we dive deep into the topics shaping our world. From the planet and politics to health, consciousness, economy, and alternative lifestyles. If you're enjoying the journey, make sure to subscribe and share this podcast with others who love exploring new perspectives.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to come back to that question we started with. How does autism lead to feelings of loneliness and difficulty fitting in? We've explored the challenges, the science, and the potential solutions. But what's the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the key takeaway is that those feelings of isolation aren't a personal failure. They're often a direct result of living in a world that's not designed for neurodiversity.
So it's not about fixing autistic people, but rather creating a more inclusive and accepting society that celebrates different ways of being.
Exactly. And that starts with understanding. Understanding the challenges, understanding the strengths, and recognizing that autism is just a different way of experiencing the world, not something that needs to be cured.
Well said. And for our listeners who've been on this deep dive with us, I hope you've gained a new understanding of all the complex factors that contribute to feelings of loneliness in autistic individuals. It's not a simple issue, but with knowledge and empathy, we can start to create a more inclusive world for everyone.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we learn about autism, the better we can support and empower people on the spectrum.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. It's been an incredible conversation. And that's a wrap on this deep dive into autism and loneliness. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep an open mind.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Echoes of Insight. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who loves exploring big ideas. Together, let's keep the conversation going. See you next time.